Signet Theater. I'm Rob Lutfi, Associate Artistic Director, and I'm here talking with two dear friends who just finished a week of workshops for the Bill and Judy Garrett Finishing Line Commission.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lamar Perry. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a freelance director. I'm also currently the Artistic Associate at the Old Globe. Some of you may be familiar with my other work. I'm currently a member of the Roundabout Directors Group and was a fellow with the National Alliance for Musical Theater this year in their digital festival.
Hi, I'm Oren Squire. Right now I'm in Miami. I use he, him pronouns. It was great to work on Run Fire at Signet and with a fantastic cast and crew. And I also write for television for shows like Brain Dead, This Is Us, and currently write on Evil and the Good Fight while continuing to write journalism pieces as an independent journalist and plays.
Thank you. You both are people that I've admired for a long time and wanted to work with. So I'm glad to finally make it happen. Oren is, in addition to writing for television and theater, you also, I was reading about how you have some national awards for museums for your multimedia work you've done, installations, and you write for the Chicago Tribune and the Miami Herald. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, I guess, the play itself, Run Fire first, about what's the play about?
Play was about, it started off as a one-act play several years ago when I was meeting with a Black executive, one of the few Black male executives I've ever met with over 10 or 15 years. And he was describing living near Central Park when there is a crime spree. And I remember we were laughing a lot in the meeting, and I was like, this is ridiculous. We're coming up with all these sketch scenarios. And I went away from that. I had a play in a one-act festival. I wrote a romantic comedy. The day before it was due, I believe was Christopher Columbus Day, so I had the day off. And I sat down and wrote out really quick, like a 25-minute play based upon our conversation. It went up, people thought it was funny, and then it just sort of gestated for several years. Fast forward to being at Juilliard, I was taking meetings in Los Angeles, and I have a background as an independent journalist and reporter. So in order to fund my trips, I started writing more articles. This coincided with Ferguson and Black Lives Matter. So I was writing a lot about that. And we had to pitch what our plans were for our second year. And I told Marsha Norman and Chris Durang, I don't really know what to do because it feels like I should write about what's going on. At the same time, I feel exhausted because I've written so much about it in nonfiction form. Mm-hmm. And Marsha Norman said, well, that's sometimes when you go further, when you feel like you've exhausted a topic and you haven't actually, because the audience doesn't know that you've been writing about this for 20 years or 10 years, but you feel like that, then that is a point where maybe you're about to have a breakthrough rather than quitting and moving on. And I think she was picking up on the tone and the theme of American theater is that Americans always like new stuff. And even as artists, we want to quickly move on to the new thing. We don't want to linger. When in fact, if you study great artists from the past, they repeatedly do the same thing again and again. And all we're noticing is the finished product of Uncle Vanya. We don't know the two versions before of Chekhov of that bad play, the wood binder, the wood whatever, the wood demon, that then was bad. And in an American setting, it would be move on. You should write a cop drama. But he was like, no, I'm going to return to this, and I'm going to keep honing this particular tone that we all know as Chekhovian. We all know that tone, but we know that tone because he was refining it. He didn't just jump around. And so being an American in this time, sometimes I tend to jump around. I want to jump immediately to the next thing because I was like, I'm bored, I've exhausted this. And she reminded us that sometimes it's about honing that brushstroke again and again. It isn't about moving on. And it made me think of, I briefly took Japanese calligraphy at this place, and it's, the first class is the same brushstroke. And you're like, I can't tell the difference. You're doing bop, 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 and you're like, done. Bop, 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 this is boring. You keep doing this same brushstroke, and the teacher's like, no. And you look at it, you're like, what do you mean no? It's the same thing it's the same symbol. And then the second, I hate to sound magical, but it really does happen. You come in the second week and you start doing the symbol, bop, 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 and you're like, oh, this is different. In that week of gestating and processing and thinking about it, in a simple stroke, it's different. And it's the same character that you're making. And that's when I think most of the painters start getting, a light bulb goes on. It's not good yet, but you're like, oh, I'm doing the same thing, and it's different because the muscle in my arm and the focus is just more settled. I didn't just come off the street like the first class, dump my bags down from work and go, all right, what's this? And then copy it. And then by the third or fourth week, you become lost in the process, and you're noticing other people's work as well as your work. And it is different when you repeat the brushstroke again and again. Then by the fifth or sixth week, you're so grateful that you didn't quit the first week, that you didn't walk away like some people did, like, this is boring and stupid. I want to move on and write 20 different characters, as opposed to, no, do this one thing again and again. So I took that advice into consideration, and I had this old play that was like only 20 pages, and only like one of the characters maybe is in there. And then I had those thoughts, and I processed all the articles I've written about police brutality and all the things that are going on. And I sort of just sat with it and worked on that brushstroke, worked on that particular style that fits the story, that is absurd, that is surreal, that has layers, that have been allowed to settle over time. And that's something that you can't fake, like an expert dancer that's been doing the same dance for 10 years and they know the insides and outs of the moves. That just comes with time, which is the thing I think I am and many artists are most impatient about. We want to move on quick, do the next thing. And so it's all about not only developing the story, but it's always about how we're developing our voice and our craft by looking at the brushstroke in different ways, by returning to it, by processing it, by waiting, and then letting time work on us as artists, and then how that flows out when we go out into the world. So that was a process of it, and I wrote it out, and it was different because last year I'd written a play from scratch, completely new style, and it wasn't settled. You could feel it. Even though it had imagination, it wasn't settled. And then I returned to some of the themes I'm familiar with, and you add these little extra details, you carry it a step further, and it landed. We did it in the Juilliard lab. I submitted it to the O'Neill, where I hadn't gotten in before. I immediately got in because the brushstroke and the time had settled the piece more, had settled the tone, which is very difficult when you're working in an absurdist, hyper-real play, to have a settled tone within a extravagant world that is outside the usual bounds of naturalism that we like to employ in American theater. So that was a long process that I did not intend when I wrote a short play a long time ago, had it done, and then put it away in my drawer. And so I think that's a message. Sometimes the new work, in order to get inspiration, it's nice to open up the drawer and look at where you've been. And look at, okay, I'm going to add this thing here, and I'm going to do this. Because if you don't, I feel like every day, every new project, you're reinventing the wheel, and it has that new energy that isn't settled. And it is that balance of, we all want to be the artist doing 20,000 things, but wouldn't it be better to do one or two things well than 20,000 things half shot and just in this frenetic ADD sort of energy.
Mm. And then, so speaking of the development, so it went through the O'Neill, and then did it stop anywhere else? Didn't it stop in North Carolina before?
Yes, and Lee Street put it up for 2 weeks. I worked on it some more and processed that. And then we read it somewhere else, but that was just among friends. And it's just a continual process. And you put it down and you move on to somebody else, you pick it back up, and hopefully time has worked on you some more, and then you go back and you just refine it. And there are other pieces I write in one day and they're done, by the way. So it's nice to have that balance. There are pieces you write and you're like, done, like next, like Lamar's Red Beast. I just sat down and wrote that 2 or 3 weeks before I had to turn in to play at Juilliard. I was like, and done. As opposed to Running on Fire, which I craft. But Beast, I'm like, yeah, I know these voices. I'm finished. Bye. I'll tweak it, but like it's settled. So it is that balance of knowing when you're jumping to something new and when you have to return to the roots.
Well said. Lamar, will you talk about the first time you read this play and your initial thoughts? Because we had a really great phone call, I remember, and you were pretty on fire.
No pun intended. Wow. The first time I read Run Fire, so I just like context of time. The first time I read this play was late 2020. Was still grappling with my own relationships, the massive amount of Black death that we watched happen. Was still dealing with the pandemic, was dealing with death and loss and grief and anger and all of the different emotions of what being queer and what being Black in America was at the time. So I read this play and instantaneously felt like someone had given voice to the nuanced and complex conversations I wanted to have about identity in the midst of all of this crisis. How do we talk about Blackness? How do we talk about Blackness within the movement? How do we talk about queerness and how that can be weaponized by white people? All of these different intricate conversations in which I think we often just have broad stroke conversations in which we generalize or we talk about things as if they're a monolith, as if Blackness or queerness or maleness are just these singular institutions, and they lack the actual depth of human experience. So when I was reading Run Fire the first time, I was just shocked and amazed by the agency with which Oren wrote these characters, with the conflicts and the conversations that they were having, and the conversations that they weren't having that they would inspire in the audience. Ultimately we create art for it to be consumed. You don't control how it's consumed, but you hope that good art will leave an audience member indicting themselves, indicting their nation, indicting their community. And I think that's what happened. So when you and I hopped on the phone, Robbie, I was just running through the litany of questions in my mind because I was so interested to see how many questions people could ask themselves based on the play that Oren had written. I think it's a really beautiful examination of what is the role of any one of us who occupy the space of Blackness within the Black Lives Matter movement. What is the intersection of privilege and identity and socioeconomics in the face of Blackness? How do our white allies show up for us? How is queerness weaponized against or used as a defense in popular culture? All of these things that I think are there and are conversations that we have privately with our friends, with our community, but are not necessarily conversations that we have in larger spaces. So I was really just lit on fire. And that's the second time I made that reference, and I'm gonna put it away for the rest of this interview, but I really was incised by what I read and was also just pissed off. I had a lot of anger that I needed to displace at the time, and that play just gave me a place to put it.
Yeah, agreed. Will you talk briefly about your working relationship? Because you've both worked together once before, right?
Yeah, so I just started working with Oren, I would say August of 2020. Sometime in the summer, I think I had just turned 30. I'm telling my business, but that's okay, because I don't look my age. So I was directing one of the episodes for Walks of Life at the La Jolla Playhouse, which was a co-production with the Blind Spot Collective here in San Diego. And they called me up and they were like, hey, we really loved your first piece. We're moving on to the next phase for Walk of Life, which is, a series of musicals. Here's this team. We think you'd really be interested, in this 10-minute musical, which felt like a challenge that I would love to rise to. And they told me who the team was. I'm a total theater nerd, so I recognized everyone's names. I knew Anastasia, or knew of her. I'd heard of Oren. You have the dream people that you want to work with, that you're always, especially as a director, trying to figure out well, damn, how do I get connected to this playwright? How do I find an in with this person so that we can start to develop a relationship? And the Playhouse facilitated that. We went through a short but quick process in which I immediately recognized that there was an artistic partnership and a friendship that I was interested in expanding and developing. So we walked away from that process, and I think maybe a couple of days later, I sent Oren an email. I was like, hey, I actually had a really good time. I really like working with you. I hope that we can keep this relationship going or deepen our relationship. I had just been announced with Roundabout, so I was looking for plays and things to develop, and we kind of just started talking and kept the conversation going from there. He brought to me the workshop he was working on with you guys. And I think it's been pretty smooth sailing since. Artistic partnerships in American theater are kind of what you hope for. You hope to meet playwrights and directors who you have a common language with, who you can just immediately drop into the world of the thing together, and where you also like each other. Because for the amount of time that you have to spend together in theater, if you hate the person, it's going to be miserable. And I really was fortunate to find that in Oren, and someone who is brilliant and is a luminary in the American theater, also in television and film, who's also just a nice guy that I like to listen to. He's really smart, and I was saying to him the other day, I always feel like I walk away from our conversations lifted and having learned something, and that's the kind of challenge that I want at this point in my career, and also the kind of people that I want to surround myself with.
Yeah, I thought Lamar, it was great because that project at La Jolla, was it La Jolla or Old Globe? Anyway,
Oh yeah.
La Jolla, I was so tired.
Mm-hmm.
I told Anastasia and Michael, if you could think up a theme, I'll write it. I just don't, I'm really tired. I don't want to think. And so they kicked around a theme. I was like, all right, I'll write that. And so I'm glad that we were all in yes mode. Because I was like, I am completely so tired that I'm open, and I'm just gonna write and flow where I grow and where I gravitate towards. And I thought it was a good collaboration to understand tone and levels, and especially in a musical with tones, levels, and timing, because I feel like due to the nature of American theater, I meet a lot of very talented directors of color who can only do tragedy and August Wilson. Mm-hmm. And it's not their fault, but when you only are doing August Wilson and Raisin in the Sun in damn Whitey plays in college, and then you move on to running the circuit and trying to get that first job, usually it'll be a August Wilson play or Raisin in the Sun. Mm-hmm. Then you get another Raisin in the Sun, and then you're just hopping on the Raisin around the country. And then at a certain point, you try to switch over to a new work that isn't set with that voice in the 60s or 50s or 70s or 80s, and that has irony or has tones of mischievousness, has tones of other tones and colors outside of the big, broad, things that we're familiar with. And it flies over people's heads, not because they're not intelligent, but because there's not that room for nuances, for artists of color to express nuances. So that muscle is atrophied. Mm. And everything becomes August Wilson. Everything becomes like a 10 as far as intensity. And it's like, okay, you're ironic. I mean, I had another play somewhere, and the actor was performing it with this extreme sense of earnestness. And the character they're performing was a version of me. And so they were saying these things, which is supposed to have like ironic, sarcastic tones. But he was like, and I dream of a world. And I was like, can we time out? Can we stop for a minute? Okay, you sound very naive. Because you sound very naive and hardcore. You have no arc anymore. If you are a New Yorker and you're sarcastic, then you can get to earnestness. But if the beginning of the play, you're like, Mama, I think I'm gonna make it. If you're in Clifford Odets territory, dude, we end up at Clifford Odets. How are you gonna start with Golden Boy? And like, I just want a chance, Ma. And it's like, no. Then the character's flat. Then you're just watching this earnest Black boy dealing with, racism in this wide-eyed way. Like, wow, America, race. When it's kind of like, no, you weren't born yesterday. You have experience. It's kind of my riff with people in the past who play Othello, like he's been Black for one day. But then again, it's written like that, like he's been Black for one day. So like I would watch it and I'm like, yeah, these white people are plotting against you, man. Don't you know that? But like the people perform it like they perform it like Othello's like dumb when he's supposed to be a military genius because they don't have the levels. And so like you're trying to find directors and artists who have that very rare thing. They know how to do the classics, but they also know how to do contemporary theater that sounds like it exists within the mouths of people living today. And it isn't, it doesn't have that feel that sometimes I feel like writers in my generation, they know how to be successful. You pretend like you're August Wilson, or that you pretend like you're writing another version of For Color Girls, and you slam some poetry in there, and you're like, I feel the rivers, the tom-tom drums, the rhythm, the sways of Africa, and the African diaspora is taking me back. And most white people don't know that that's cheesy. Most white people don't know that that's like really bad poetry and hokey and playing on their blind spot and their unawareness of what actually is taste and discernment in Black art, because most Black art goes through white gatekeepers. So they have no idea of like, no, Black people don't talk like that. No, that's unrealistic. That Black person only exists in poetry. So what you see on stage is sort of this vicious cycle of white gatekeepers putting out work that feels comfortable for them, that has Black people that feel like they were either born yesterday or don't have levels. They're existing at the tragedy level of Othello in the last act for the entire play. And then that becomes the aesthetic of Black art. It becomes bad. It lacks taste. It lacks levels. And then subtly, white gatekeepers begin to think, well, that's just Black art. It lacks levels and layers. It lacks irony. It lacks sarcasm. It lacks absurdity. Black art is, the man shot my mama and sicked the dog on my daddy. And now it's like the same thing over and over again. It's native son Black boy. And there's a place for that. But there's so much more. There's so many other colors to this experience than tragedy or slapstick.
We'll tie that
and
back.
Finding artists like that is important. Anyway.
Yeah, or because in this play you write about the sublime and the abstract. Specifically, in the character of Black Reason. Would you talk a little bit about how either one of you lace that through the play?
Yeah,
I had another play where, it was Obamaology.
Oh yeah.
And it was first, once again, a short play that got people like, oh, we really like this. So I expanded it out into a full-length play. And I got the suggestion from a friend who said, wouldn't it be great if you had an absurd Black voice? And I was like, no, but I will take that comment and file it away for another play someday. So sometimes people give you a comment and like, wow, that's a good idea. This is not the project. So I was reaching in and I remember, oh yeah, this guy mentioned, what if you have someone commenting on the play and the code switching that happens, the external code switching, but also the internal code switching where you're having this debate with yourself. and how that debate becomes like another character. And I realized that some people don't have that debate because society is built around their opinion. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to have a debate with yourself. If something's wrong, it's just wrong. There isn't, it's like, you know, you see the videos of the Karens in the world and you get that the outrage is coming from this very shallow water of not having to develop those layers. So when something doesn't seem right, they don't process it and think. There's no internal debate. There's no Karen voice of reason on the inside that goes, okay, maybe this Black guy wearing a UPS uniform is a UPS person who's delivering something in the building. It goes, no. They're like, there's something wrong here. And then they react. And then when you look at it, you're like, wow, that was crazy the way you reacted like that. Don't you have an internal debate system in your mind that processes? They don't. And so Black Voice of Reason was that sort of externalizing that debate level that happens with, I think, most Black people.
Yeah. I think, so then comes the director who like has to be responsible for like finding an interpretation and developing a language to talk about this with designers and with actors. And one of the things that was really important for me in this play, like as Oren was mentioning, like the nuance, you know, the removal from the opinion that like Blackness is a monolith, that there's just one experience. So when I was looking at The Voice of Black Reason, like I'm a very structural director. I mean, Robbie, you just spent time in rehearsal with me. I love to like break down the bits and really get to like, what are the foundational structures of what we're talking about? What are the archetypes? What are the stereotypes? How do they interact? When are we subverting them? Especially as we talk about plays that like occupy space that are both absurd and realistic and naturalistic. It's really important to understand like who is your character and what world they exist in. And the trope for Black Reason is the magical Negro. We automatically have the subversion of that stereotype because magical Negroes typically serve white characters. So when you look at like Will Smith and Bagger Vance, or you know, any litany of Black characters that come to save a white protagonist who have some kind of mystical ability, automatically we flip that on this head because Black Reason is showing up for another Black person. What is that? What is their relationship? What makes them different? What makes them similar? What is the nuance of their relationship? How do they start the play and how do they end the play? You know, as a Black person who's wanting to flip tropes on their head, flip stereotypes and archetypes on their head, but particularly the ones that lead to the violence that's perpetuated against Black people, you know, there is this collective consciousness in the American theater that's decided like there is a type of magical Black person that only that isn't educated, that is only funny and probably has a Southern accent and is just there to serve other people. And actually, you can have the accent and be funny and still be brilliant and still be human and still have a wide berth of human experience and knowledge. So we see this journey for Black Reason, who is essentially coming to teach this young Black man the things that he has not been able to accept in his own life about his Blackness to save his life. There's a specific way that you talk to cops. There are a way that you finesse those situations, not because you're having a conversation with a peer or with an equal, but because you're just trying to live through the situation to see another day, so that you can grow, so that you can evolve, so that you can have the depth of humanity and human experience that Oren is talking about. So Black Reason starts as a trope, as a jester, but ultimately is actually a sage, someone who has knowledge, who is tapped into this other world and is showing up to do a sacred duty, which is to save, to protect, to care, to just get you to the next day. Because the unfortunate reality of being Black in this country, especially when you're in the face of the police, is that you don't often make it to the next day. So again, it's really about humanizing and deepening understandings so that, again, ultimately the violence that we experience can be dismantled as we continue to be understood and told in more than just one way.
You're reminding me that I wrote a play more than 15 years ago called Bleed, about a guy that bleeds to death over the course of 24 hours. It's a comedy. It's absurd. And he's just bleeding to death, and he never really figures out why. So whatever. It still plays you right when you're in your early 20s. It's existential. And to juice it up, I added a magical black janitor just to make it ridiculous. And the magical black janitor opens to play mopping, and he's like, "Oh, hello there." And like, he's talking in this way. And it was just something that I thought was funny based upon a story of being in a hospital, and the story that also my professor was in a hospital, had these bad experiences where they leave you, they ship you home and you're like still bleeding. So I wrote that. It's been done in workshops and readings. Every single time in the cast list, the only race that's stated is magical black janitor because it's in the title of the character. And he's absurd. And then by the end, he's a little bit less absurd. And then the guy just bleeds to death and dissolves into water. And the magical black janitor has like the last comment as he's mopping up the whiteness. He's mopping up the whiteness that he's been narrating. Every time it's been done, though, I forgot that I didn't put any of the other races in the description, but everyone knows how to cast it. The lead character is white. This word, like, perfectly, everyone always cast it. And I was like, it only was years later that someone say, you never put the description of the race of that character or any of the characters. And I was like, I guess we're just so used to seeing magical Negroes help white people. We don't even have to state it. And then later on, when he's abused by these other characters, it is always cast as black people abusing this white guy. And as this schlubby white guy is being put upon. And I never said a word. I never gave any casting notes. I would just observe how we assume American culture is through the casting. Yeah. And it works. People laugh because they get the trope of like the put upon white male, falling down with Michael Douglas. And these absurdly ghetto black people, even though they're not black, but they automatically, they're talking rough. Let's cast them as black. Yeah. And then, the white character, the lead character has to be white because he's being helped by a black person. Yeah. He could be Asian, he could be Latino, he could be black, but anyway, it's very funny. Yeah.
I think, just to really quickly piggyback, I think it's also important to note that like Black Reason in this play for me is also about subverting implicit bias. There's this notion that like when you're, the affects, the dialects, the colloquialisms of Black speech are still equated in popular culture with being uneducated, and that's just not true. That you can be wise, you can be intelligent, you can be worldly, you can be otherworldly, and still possess that kind of speech. Because when I think about the people in my life, the sages in my life who have taught me not just how to survive an incident with police, but like how to structure a story, how to sing a song, like the essential skills that I use in my craft today, those people talk like my grandmother, they talk like my cousins, they talk like, my great-grandparents who are all from the South. And like, I think it's really important, Katori Hall talks about this a lot, about like language and how our natural tongues are really important to put on stage. And I think that was a really important layer to lift. For Voice of Black Reason, that like we're suspending the belief that the magical Negro can only exist to help a white person, and also that like this caricature of language that's often put upon them isn't rooted in something real and something that is beautiful and something that's meaningful to the community that's a part of.
And you bring up like Black culture is really, it's so unique in America. I was watching a documentary about hip hop, and it went into all these different cities and how the hip hop is different in each city. And it finally clicked, like Black culture is so regional because we didn't have the advantage of access to mainstream media until now, the internet. It's so regional because it was people who were cut off from the outside world, who didn't identify with mainstream media when they turned on the Johnny Carson show, creating their own thing. So that's why Oakland hip hop sounds so different from across the bay in San Francisco, sounds so different from Los Angeles, sounds so different from Seattle. And each one of these cities has a different sound because people are like, well, it's just us. I guess we better do something. And I know when you usually see Blackness in mainstream, it gets generalized, which is fine because maybe it's too extreme to have like requiring people to have like, no, that's an Oakland accent. You should have a slightly off East Bay. It might be too much. But the lack of access to resources has actually defined and made Black culture so rich and layered. And then when you see people from Oakland hook up with rappers from Chicago, hook up with producers from New York, you automatically get all these other things going on because there's a common thread underneath that. And then there are all these tones and polysyllabic tones playing from these slightly different variations. And that is something that really doesn't exist in the mainstream culture. It existed for like a minute with grunge music with Seattle, but then every place became Seattle. It didn't pop off and you had like Milwaukee white people doing grunge in a unique way. Everyone was sort of just copying Seattle for a while in like one or two other cities. But in America, you can have like Atlanta, Black Atlanta pop off with something, and then Oakland pop off, and then Houston with Megan Thee Stallion and Beyonce and that whole style. And they give shout outs, they reference the place. So that, you know, I come from Miami, so it's Luther Campbell, it's that Miami bass, it's Trina, it's Trick Daddy, and that has a very specific sound. And sometimes you see this wonderful interplay of tones happening, and that is Black culture. It is naturally that shifty. You know, I was working on a musical about jazz music, and you see the shifts in the New Orleans jazz musicians going up the riverboat to Chicago, mixing with Chicago, and then mixing with Kansas City and St. Louis. And that became what we know as jazz. We assume it's naturally like that, but it was players from different regions who were obviously cut off because there was no internet or TV. And New Orleans jazz had this flavor. Chicago musicians had this flavor. Kansas City had this flavor. And then along the river, they would all like gather up, and then they hit the big city like Chicago and New York, and they play, and there's all these tones happening. And so that's something that's beautiful that, you know, shouldn't take for granted, but I'm reminded of that when we talk about dialect in diaspora, because I realize we're doing like a bunch of little things popping off with different dialects.
Really powerful moment in the play too, when a character transforms into the voice of Black Reason. I know you don't like summaries, Oren, so I wondered if Lamar, you could give us like what's at the heart of this play, and or like what's the elevator pitch of the play?
Ooh, okay. What's the elevator pitch of this play? To me, at its core, it is a play about identity. It is a play about complex individuals trying to explore their humanity amongst the backdrop of the chaos that is our world. You know, what is it to occupy a space of privilege and also occupy Blackness and maleness, and then be thrust forward into the middle of a protest? You know, how do you reconcile all that? What does respectability politics do for Black people in the face of imminent danger? I think one of the really beautiful things about this play is it's a play about agency. You know, you watch these characters constantly have the opportunity, Oren and I were talking about this, the idea of like the sinking ship. They constantly have the opportunity to patch the ship or to get off of the highway exit and derail from moments of imminent doom or chaos or catastrophe, and yet their pride, their ego, their id causes them to keep moving forward. If at any point in time, if any one of these characters had just stopped and gotten off, the rest of the events of the play wouldn't happen. But the truth of humanity is that we make those choices. We keep pushing. We somehow lose a sense of our own self-preservation or the preservation of others, and we just keep going forward in this cyclical manner. So I think this play really causes us to examine what are our own cycles, where can we get off and where can we derail the chaos, and are we just cursed in a sense to just continue to repeat history? You know, from first meeting, are we doomed? Or do we actually have some kind of universal agency to repurpose our energy and do something different and to save the ship and not for anyone else and for nothing other than you deserve to be saved and you deserve to have the right to live and to breathe and to explore and to grow and to expand outside of the constraints of some inherited bullshit that isn't yours personally.
Geography of identity. I recall reading something several years ago, and Obamaology was going up in London. I was in school messaging the director, and we were talking about it, and I realized that I never verbalized the way I saw the play, because the way I see things is different from the way most plays are done. So I usually just keep it to myself. But there's a French philosopher called Marc Aurèle who talks about non-places and negative empathy. And a non-place is, you go to the CVS, let's say around the block. That CVS is the same CVS as the one in Houston, is the same CVS as the one in Paris. And it's a non-place in that once you enter that box, you could be in any CVS in the world. When you enter a Motel 6, they have designed the box of that existence so that you are in any Motel 6 anywhere in the world. It has a basic look, and it's disorienting on purpose so that you sort of, the reality of where you are geographically fades away, and it's disorienting. And when it comes to identity, it's about what happens when you enter those non-reality spaces and you becomes like slightly disoriented. And I usually see plays more fluid, and Lamar knows this. I write scenes on top of each other, and it's not because I'm trying to be cool. Like literally I see like two scenes happening at once, and a third scene and something coming in, then this orchestration happening. And in order to do that, it's sort of, everything has to exist in this non-reality stasis that then pops up and it becomes a city hall meeting. And then it goes back to this thing, and then it becomes the park. And then it goes back and then it becomes an apartment and the park at the same time. And then the people are interacting in these sort of non-places, because that's where we get jarred and confused. So we were talking about Obamaology and how I wanted these three scenes to happen in the foreground, middle ground, background, like almost a movie. And I was like, they're happening at the same time. The background's commenting on the middle ground's commenting on the foreground with the audience. And it's a compression of that space that where you can look at it and it's an orchestra all talking at once. And then you can take it back out and you see the three levels going on. And so you'll see in this play, there are scenes, obviously we're on Zoom, so we're limited, but there's scenes that are supposed to be that two things happening, and then it becomes one thing. You compress it and it becomes one conversation in two spaces. And then it goes back out and it's two different conversations in two places. And that's sort of what happens with identity and geography. That's what happens with space and time, with non-places. Non-places not only disorient you where you are spatially, they just orient your nature of time. And I feel like what we have with these boxes now on Zoom and what our reality is, it is, I mean, you try to find the geographical interesting things that differentiate yourself. But really, if we could all have the same backdrop and be in a non-place. We could all choose a back screen of like the stars or the galaxy or the Milky Way or, you know, Hawaii. And we know we're in a non-place because we're not really in Hawaii, but we've created this effect of like, I don't want to be here, so I'm going to detach from this reality. And I feel like we're doing that with identity, not only with the Rachel Dolezals, but there, for everyone that like that, there's so many more. I feel like with, in a good way, with gender, with sexuality, with racial identity. In the 60s, we set these hard and fast rules, and we set these spatial dynamics and these time dynamics, and therefore theater was naturalistic because this is a play about coming out as gay among a bunch of gay men. It's very solid. It's a very solid location. This is a play about being Black in a tenement apartment in Chicago. It's a solid place. And generally, I write plays where like there's this flow that happens, like the scenes almost dissolve on purpose. And my favorite stage direction, as Lamar knows, is light shift. Because that can mean it's just light shift, and then you go like, what does that mean? It's like it just shifts, the light shifts, and that's a cue to the audience. Something is happening with time and space. We're either in another location, we're in a flashback, light shift. And if you train an audience, light shift, every time you do a light shift, they know that something is happening with time and space. And then you can loosen the boundaries of not only time and space on stage, but the time and space in their life, the identities they hold on to. You begin to loosen those hard rules that, unfortunately, most of our identity politics is defined by from like 5 generations ago. And it becomes more fluid and more free. And then guess what? People have more agency because they can sort of float around into this scene, and they're saying something at their scene, but they're commenting on this other scene. The other person is saying in that scene, and the audience is aware of this, like, oh, this is this play. There's a play going on. There's an interplay going on of what's happening in time and space and identity. So it's a very weird concept to use architectural language in theater. We talk about non-reality or non-places, but it's my default. It's what I naturally go to. I always find like, here's the setting, and now this is gonna rise up, and then it dissolves. And this rise, it's almost like sound. This rises up, and then it dissolves. And then both of these rise up, and then they dissolve, and then they go this way. And if you're an old audience member, it might seem like, oh, this is a mistake, or why isn't there a set here? Why isn't there a door that I can open? I am not interested ever in seeing a standalone door in one of my plays. Or someone like, when you see like the door in space, it's like, we get a door if you just make a light in the shape of a doorway. Mm-hmm. We don't need an actual physical doorway for someone to pull on. And that is more interesting to me when you force people to conceptualize. And that's the only one of the few unique things about theater, because as we know in TV and film, you have to literally show the door. Yeah. Not only that, you literally need the wall. Otherwise, you're doing something experimental. The beauty of theater is that we could say, light, and then we go, oh, that's a doorway. And I could go, light. You go, that's a table. I can go, light. That's a skyline. Mm-hmm. Begin play. And then you can move the skyline magically, and someone's having a dream. Or you thought you were in reality and something happened to the door, and you realize you're in someone's alternative space. And then it settles, and the doorway becomes a passageway, and it starts turning into a window. And it forces the audience to participate in the creation of the narrative through the suggestion of symbolic things rather than the literal representation of door, wall, black, white, male, female. You allow the suggestion, and the audience fills that in, and then you tweak it a little bit. And that's what we're doing in Run Fire with the identities of Marcus, with Garrett, and queerness and gayness, with Hannah and femininity and white femininity. And social media is you're offering the suggestion in the audience, like a good magician, like a good magician's audience. The audience goes, oh, I know what that is. Right. And they leap to an assumption, and then you just undercut their assumption ever so slightly. And then they're like, oh, it isn't that thing. Right. But you have to be willing to go along for that ride and not be like, that's a mistake, because I said that was going to be a rabbit in a hat. And now it's something else. It's like, well, no, it's a suggestion. I never said it wasn't a rabbit in a hat, but I never said it was only a rabbit in a hat. The rabbit in a hat can become something else, just like the door, just like time and space, just like identity.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And Oren, I want to highlight, so like picking back to like artistic collaboration, it's really important, especially in the American theater, to like find folks that you work with who get your vision. Like, I think from the onset, Oren and I very quickly saw that like, he understood me and I understood him, and that our brains were thinking in a very similar way, so that when we talk about the art, like there's no, well, let me decode this for you because I think you're not quite seeing that. Like, I think we're generally on the same page, which just makes for stronger collaboration, which allows the kind of work that you guys are going to see in the presentation to really show up, to really dive into the nuance of these interrogations and examinations as you're suspending belief. Because that's what you come to the theater for anyway, to suspend belief.
Yeah, and I love TV and film, but it exercises a different, it kind of lets you sit back and relax, because it's like, you present the world, as opposed to theater where you have to sit up and participate.
Yes.
You have to be like, oh, that's that thing and that's that thing. Okay, I got it. You know, until you see like plays where they try to recreate literally everything, and then they always fail because you can't in a play unless you have a $10 million budget. You cannot recreate the world on stage, which in fact frees you up to bring the audience in and participate.
I don't know. We do a pretty good job here at the Globe of recreating things. I do have to say.
But can you do as good a job as a movie?
No. Oh, no.
Exactly, because a movie is world building.
This is still nonprofit theater.
Exactly.
Coins don't exist. Not like that.
Movies and video games are total world building, which is nice, but theater is the only participatory art form that has been around for 4,000 or 5,000 years that always grows your brain because you have to contribute. You have to add in. Even at the height of naturalism, you couldn't go full naturalism because you'd be on a movie set. You have to, even that, you have to sort of give the suggestion, go, okay, we're gonna pay for a real faucet. I'm gonna put a tank under here with water so you can turn on this sucker. And then we as an audience member go, wow. And guess what? That actually takes you out of the play.
Yeah.
Because then you start thinking, how'd they do that? You
Right.
start going like,
Water
so they have a
get on.
tank under there, and then they have water, and then they have a real kitchen, and then you're not even thinking about the play anymore. You're thinking about how they did the thing
Mechanics
that
of
they're
it.
focusing on.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the fact that also in your play, the internet becomes a character, which is really theatrical and beautiful.
Yeah, it rises up in that level and then sort of dissolves back and colors the mood as the play goes forward, because this thing colors our mood every day, every moment of the day.
Yep.
And we're not even aware, like, we can tap into anything in the world, and then we let that portal open up and it affects us, and then we go on about our day in reality with people, but with this tone and with this odor or perfume that's coming out of this thing all the time, whenever we want it to, like a genie.
The sad reality of this non-place that you were describing in Runfire too is that that's any park, that's any marathon, that's any cop, that's any couple, no matter what city you're in America. And I think that that's beautiful, you know, even though you said you initially wrote it because of a conversation you had about something in Central Park. You never mentioned once any location other than park.
Yeah. And it came out of conversations with directors like Lamar. This British director asked me a question, and I realized he was about to direct it as a natural play. And then I realized that was my fault because I didn't explain how something should feel, which forced me to verbalize and find theories and find examples and build out. And then I realized, oh my God, I've been writing like this for years. I just never had to verbalize, like, this is what's going on. I just sort of assumed someone was going to mess up the play. I just let it go. And I was like, you know what? Actually tell them this is what non-space aesthetic theater, negative empathy theater is. And maybe it's something that'll catch on. Maybe it's something that is catching on naturally because that's what people are craving now with internet, TV, and film so accessible. They're craving that suggestion more, that magical suggestion that we all agree to. When the lights dim and the lights shift and the lights come up, we all agree to this strange ritual of light and movement that happens in theater that puts us into this communal trance.
Yeah, and I see it showing up more and more. You know, I look at like Dave Harris's work, you know, which deals with like this concept that I like to call like the nexus, like the place where anything and everything can happen, where it's all real, where the concrete is not what you're aiming to do, but like the icon of a thing. As Oren was saying, you don't need a door to tell the theater audience that it's a door. A light cue or a sound is enough for us to go there with you. So I think we want more of that because I do think you're right. Like the naturalistic and the realism of it all has told such a specific narrative, especially when it comes to like Blackness, what is allowed of the Black canon in the larger American theater canon, and then whose work is getting produced. You know, I often wonder, you know, I think about August Wilson and Lorraine Hansberry a lot. Like, You know, the two are large Black luminaries who are produced every season at every regional theater in the country. And I wonder if the art that they created is being produced in within the context in which they created the art. You know, so like I think we need more disruption, because while there's space for those things and they are truthful, there's also so much more. And I think as we come into like a global consciousness and a deeper understanding of our own humanity and ourselves, we understand that like these singular images are not the entire picture. And I think for those of us who are marginalized, those images are often for some people the only images they come into contact with. So it's our responsibility to make sure that we're providing as many images as possible so that the person at hand isn't as easy to other, isn't as easy to dehumanize.
Mm-hmm. There was a play from grad school. I think it was called, I'll look it up, Deer Park. Someone did that in the rep. It's a short play about a realtor showing a house to a couple. And you find out this is where a murder happened, I believe. And it's a blank stage. And it's just light. And I remember seeing that. And I was like, this is amazing, because the actors were so specific because it was a blank stage. The lighting was so specific because there was nothing on stage. And the realtor's like, well, this is the foyer, click this beginning of the play. And you feel like the actor and director had to go through every single level of what does this foyer look like. When you reach, it can't be late, like you got to really work, you know, through this space. And then it forced me to work. And I was like, what's going on? And then you hear the child's cry from the baby that was killed there, or like some suggestion of that. And then you start feeling this fear and terror, all done on a blank stage over 20, 30 minutes. And the play ended, and this is in rep with a bunch of other plays. And I think we're at intermission. I was like, that was amazing. And the person next to me was like, you like that, huh? I was like, it was different. It brought me into this new reality. It was a blank stage. She's like, I directed that. I was like, well, congratulations. She was like sitting next to me. I was like, I was just like, I still think about that play over 15 years later, like just a blank stage and a realtor being like, and this is the bathroom, you know, this is the bedroom, you know, we have 2 beds, 2 baths, and intentionally using like the non-reality, the non-space to create this new thing. And then this tragedy that's permeating the air. And that's hinted at with these like these little things happening. Anyway, so shout out to Deer Park. I'm sorry if it's not the name of the play, but that's the way I remember. It's called Deer Park.
How do you feel like this week was for both of you?
It was great. It's been such a long time since I've dived back into the story, and now there are, you know, a few brushstrokes. I was like, oh yeah, I wanted to work on that, and you know, you return once again like, oh yeah, that thing. And some of it is, you know, first read. Some of it is cool, but it's just me being nitpicky. Some of it is like, oh my God, I can't stand that. And someone else, no, I don't have a problem with that. And it's just me being in my head. So it's good when you have people you trust to bounce your idea off. Like, is that crazy? Is that just in my head? Or do other people notice that? Because sometimes it is just in my head. And I don't need to change that. But sometimes it does need to be changed. Because people are like, yeah, that's something's going on here.
Yeah. It was a really beautiful process. You know, for those of you who don't know me, who've never worked with me before, like I really value rooms that are centered around grace and kindness.
Just like you, Lamar.
Thank you, friend. But you know, it's really my job as a director to say yes, you know, to empower actors to really find their creative spark and to bring their best selves and their best ideas. So like I like to set that tone very early in the process. It's a lot of conversation, you know. I think some folks imagine that like workshopping plays is a lot of like rewrites and new pages and just striking through, and like it can be that sometimes. But I think for this specific process, what really informed the work for myself as a director and also for Oren and what he was doing was the genuine conversation that these artists, that these actors, these brilliant actors brought to the table, you know, because the space felt so safe, because people know that they were being held with kindness, that they could interrogate without antagonizing. I think it led to some really fruitful conversations about identity, about race, about gender, about sexuality, about all of the ways in which we are marginalized and also have the capacity to weaponize our individualities. And yeah, and then, you know, it's theater, so you never have enough time ever. You figure out how to make the best of it. But I'm truly grateful for this process. I'm not a prescriptive director. I really think of myself as a collaborator. And I think all I had to do was just facilitate a space for folks to feel safe enough to really jump off of the ledge and find new colors that Oren and I then could discuss. And also like want to uplift our brilliant dramaturg, Maddie Williams, who like brings such a brilliant perspective to the room. She's currently a PhD candidate at UCSD if you don't know her. Yeah, find the right people, you bring the right energy into the room, and I think is with a steady yet soft hand, just guide it and see where it goes. And that was my job.
I would love to take your class on the 12 character archetypes and new structure. I mean, when you had that rehearsal, I was sitting there taking notes. I was like, oh, this is so good.
Thank you, friend. Thank you. Structure is important, especially when you're departing from naturalism. You really have to know what it is you're dealing with so that you can pick it apart and have a perspective, a specific comment on it. Otherwise, I think it's really easy to just meander through your impulse and hope that you come out on the other side somewhat successful.
Yeah, and I'm going to make sure that I make the our audiences have some of your articles available to them that you've written or and that have a lot to do with this play, dating back from an article you sent me from 1999 in the Miami Herald, where you write about driving while Black, and then you have one in an article in Talking Points Memo, which is a step-by-step guide on how police go about destroying Black life. I mean, it's these range of articles that I read today of yours are just incredible, and I think that our audiences, as a companion piece to this play, can immerse themselves in these pieces.
Yeah, that was the Walter Scott who was shot in South Carolina. I was in fact coming back from LA. They asked me if I could write something, and I sat on the plane on the way back and I had a meeting when I landed and just wrote that out. And we sent it, and I went to a meeting where the person was sort of denying the problem of police brutality, which is weird because that was in the news that I'd been writing on the plane about this. So yeah, it's weird how I didn't really want to return to this theme again and again. It just seems to, you know, pop up out of that non-reality, out of that thing. And I'm like, oh, we're talking about this again. And maybe I'll find a new tone or a new level. I grew up reading Dostoevsky, write the great, you know, novel. But I realized you can't write the great novel or great play unless you address what's at home. And for Black people, this is what's at home rather than trying to, I don't know, put on airs. This is what's at home right now and related to our history. And it's about how we make the pain present, transform it without normalizing it, without making it seem like this is the way it has to be. You know, 2020 was a year where a lot of people had to dig down deep within themselves and find something new. And that's great. And that's wonderful. And people should be commended for being that hero to themselves as well as other people. But I just want to make sure that 2020 is not normalized. Like having to see hundreds of thousands of people die unnecessarily because of government incompetence, having people having to live in the GoFundMe land in order to bury themselves, having bodies stacked on top of each other is not normal. Just because we've overcome it does not mean we should become accustomed to living like that. And that is a Black experience in America. Just because we are overcoming it doesn't mean we should just become accustomed to the bodies piling up, the brutality piling up, the abuse continuing. Just because I'm strong doesn't mean I need to be tested all the time. And I think that is a lesson that all of America learned last year of like, you're gonna have to dig deep and a lot of you are not gonna make it, and it's completely unfair and it's arbitrary and it's brutal, and it was planned. It was predictive. Like a statistician could look and tell you exactly how it was gonna go down. And it did exactly mark up, and they adjusted the stats according to who was wearing a mask and what the message was. And they told you like, oh, 3,000 people will start dying around this day, and then 4,000 people, and then if people do this, and 5,000 people. And it almost becomes, because someone's telling you something, you accept it as fate, or you accept it as being normal. But statistics don't make normalcy. They just tell you what our patterns are. And we can change those patterns as a country when it comes to the pandemic, when it comes to race, when it comes to all the issues we're facing. You can have a statistician tell you, based upon the temperature this summer and the attitude, how many Black people are going to be shot next summer. They can tell you in a rough estimate, these are how many Black people unarmed are going to be shot next summer. The question is, what can we do to prevent that now? Not sit back and go, oh, well, that's just our new reality, like we did for teen shooting and high school shootings and school shootings, where it became the new normal. We're like, oh, well, time to buy a bulletproof backpack and learn how to stop, drop, and roll and hide. It's like, that's not normal. That is not something to normalize. But we have, and that's a failure of leadership, imagination, responsibility, and personal integrity. And that is the utilitarian, I guess, failure of surrendering to an issue rather than overcoming. Surrendering it to like, well, it'll make us stronger. Look, I've survived 3 shootings. I have character. It's like, you shouldn't have to have that character. You shouldn't have to have that character as a Black person or as someone overcoming COVID or living in this new reality. Let's not make it normal just because we're strong.
When is your book released? Because
okay, can I buy it?
Let's not make it normal. Coming on sale to Amazon.
No, all of it. And I also think it's important to note for the audience that one of the reasons I love this piece is that it engages with those topics through the Black gaze. It is when we talk about what's produced, especially for Black artists in the American theater, it's often told through a white lens for a white audience, for the auspices of a white producer. And this specifically, to me, felt like the Black community having a conversation about Blackness, about all the things Oren is talking about not normalizing it, what we need to learn, how do we get past this, in a way that didn't feel like the trauma porn that I often feel like we consume in the American theater. The show me your pain, show me your cry, give me the monologue with a Black woman in the foreground of the stage, crying her eyes out up to the heavens so that she can get her Tony. Like, it didn't feel like that. I felt like we were having a genuine conversation told from our perspective that needed to be lifted and that needed to be heard, because we are often talked at and about, but not to.
Yeah. And the other thing I should mention is about civil forfeiture and the idea that like government at any point in time could take your life, your property, your pursuit of happiness, and they could get away with it. And it exists, and it's a reality for most Black people. It's a reality for some white people, but like civil forfeiture pretty much invalidates the entire premise of the Constitution and of what America is supposed to be about. And it has become normalized that someone could just take all of your stuff and say it was drug money, or take your property, or take your life and say you were a thug. And we live in an era of not only civil forfeiture and seizing assets, seizing lives, whenever people feel like it's seizing dignity, seizing character. And how do you reclaim that without getting subsumed by it with Black Voice of Reason? How do you prevent that when someone's trying to seize your essence, your money, your property, your life, and your character by saying you're this other person that you're not.
Wow, what an amazing conversation this has been with you two. I would love to continue talking, but that's all the time we have today. I mean, really, really incredible conversation, though. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
before we finish, I do want to uplift one name, Nathan Allen Davis, who went to Juilliard with Oren, who our audiences know from. He was one of the first people that we commissioned, and then we produced his play "Wind in the Breeze." But he
Yes.
he introduced me to you, Oren, and so thank you.
Love Nathan. We get into these 2-hour conversations like I do with Lamar. We start talking about something, it starts spitting out, and I'll be like, I have to go use a bathroom. Or I was like, I should live the rest of my life because I feel like the Lotus Eater. We've been sitting here for 6 years, but yes, Nathan's fantastic.
Much
And a
love.
true spirit of an artist who isn't only creating work, but is living art. It is living an artistic life and discovering and exploring.
Mm. Well, good night, my friends.
Good
And
night. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And another thing, no, I'm joking. Like people are like, oh my God, oh Jesus.